for heart failure in patients with symptomatic chronic heart failure with or without diabetes and across a wide range of left ventricular ejection fractions. That is to say that this drug is well studied before with a well-established safety profile. And DAPA-MI trial is trying to see if the drug would have effect on cardiometabolic outcomes in patients without diabetes with acute MI and at increased risk for subsequent development of heart failure. DAPA-MI is a registry-based, randomized controlled trial. And the registry-based is one of the major innovations that makes the trial very interesting. And we will talk more details about this later. And here we're going to first introduce the methods. The study population. Eligible patients have to be clinical stable adults that are hospitalized for acute MI, no diagnosis of diabetes or chronic symptomatic heart failure, and have regional or global impairment of left ventricular systolic function or Q-wave MI. And the trial applied a all-comer strategy for its recruitment, meaning that they had a broad eligibility criteria and recruiting patients with a wide range of risk profile. So here is the first question for whoever that's going to take comps this year. What are the potential benefits of having a broad eligibility criteria? Well, students who are not going to take the comps are also welcome to answer this. Yes, please.
So the study results will have a better generalizability once to a broader population.
Mm-hmm. Yes, awesome.
What about in terms of your recruitment ability?
It's easier to recruit a participant and maybe faster to kind of reach your target sample size.
And how is that a benefit within the registry system? With the registry, we have a fixed number, right? So how will that benefit you? Anyone?
Sample size?
Exactly, you're maximizing your available source population.
Yep. Awesome. So after participants were enrolled, they were randomized into experimental group receiving dapagliflozin with standard of care, or the control group receiving placebo and the standard of care with a 1-to-1 ratio. The randomization was stratified by country, and the trial was double-blinded. After randomization, there were 2 mandatory visits, one at week 8 and one at month 12. And thereafter, participants would be followed every 10 months up to 30 months. And this whole process was partly integrated with clinical practice and real-world registries that captures clinical routine data. And how does that work? In traditional trial setting, the whole process, including screening, randomization, follow-up, and data collection, will be on systems that are built specifically for the trial. For example, the electronic data capturing system and the system for randomization and drug management. But for DAPA-MI, they used a hybrid system that incorporated clinical registries into trial operation throughout the overall process. The trial was conducted in Sweden, and the United Kingdom. Each country has its own national registries that collect data through clinical routine practice, focusing on cardiovascular health. And there are several strengths of those two registries that makes them feasible to be used in a clinical trial for data collection. First, they covers the population across the whole nation, respectively, in the two countries. And second, the data collected were structured in this registry in the way that it's similar to case report form that we use in clinical trials. So it's already a very structured data. And all the data are collected prospectively as part of the clinical routine, and they're regularly audited for quality assurance. And last but not least, they have shared technical platform that could help with data transfer from the registry to the trial-specific data platform. So when patient came to the hospital for acute MI, they will be logged into the registry and can be identified as a potential participant almost right away. If they met all eligibility criteria and signed the informed consent form, they can be randomized during their indexed hospitalization or within 10 days, using a computerized randomization functionality that's supported by the registry-based randomized controlled trial framework. All baseline data at the time point of randomization were collected into the registry and automatically exports from the registry to the electronic data capture system used by built for the trial. And after enrollment, follow-up data will be captured from both clinical registries and trial-specific data collection procedures. In Sweden, data from the first 2 follow-up visits after randomization was exported from the registry directly. And every 10-month visit after that, the vital status are collected through the registry, while other data are collected directly into the trial electronic data capture system. And in England, all of the follow-up visit, including the first 2, only vital status are collected from the registry, and other data points were collected directly into the EDC system. So what are the potential benefits and limitations or concerns of incorporating real-world registries in a clinical trial? Let's talk about benefits first. Anyone could see any benefit why they would want to do this?
But to me, I think it's related to the previous question, right? So you really have access to a large group of people, right? It's generalizable. You have them right there. These data are routinely entered, and that maybe ties into the disadvantages. But that seems like you have them right there, and you're collecting data routinely in the system. So that seems like an efficient approach, potentially at least.
Exactly. Efficiency is important.
And cost saving, you save a lot of money.
Yeah, that's also good. Yeah, good point.
Yep.
So I can talk about some limitations.
Mhm.
They'll tie to the benefits because you have a pre-designed registry platform. So the data you are collecting could be more limited, that they want to collect extra cardio metabolic measurements from this population, but it could be harder to incorporate the additional measurement requirement into the system. And so that's kind of major limitation I can think of.
Right, and you would also think that the whole QA, QC process might be more difficult with routine data. So routine data has a little bit of the, I think, the stigma that the quality is not all that good oftentimes. But I guess it also depends on how you actually use the system, and how you implement quality checks and all of these things.
Totally. One of the things that was highlighted in these two registries is they are routinely audited. I think one of them is checked annually. Another one I can't quite remember, but they are have pretty regular oversight of the quality, which is partly why this trial can went on very smoothly, I think.
And that's, I think, related to that is Emily's point in the chat that that there might be incomplete or missing data as a worry.
Exactly. And that's also like they would collect less data than what the clinical trial would wanted, and that's why they kind of have this two sources data collection. One is the registry, and one they also collect extra data from the trial process directly. And so we kind of talked about most of the point here. Reduced burden for patients and healthcare professionals is another one that I would want to add. And then for the limited safety data collected through the registry, the reason why I point out that this drug at the very beginning, that this drug is well studied, make this trial happen because we already have, or people already have a pretty good understanding on the safety profile of the drug. So this limitation can be partly addressed by that in this trial specifically. And also the mismatch and quality of the data, depending on like the availability and the quality of the registry, which is also one of the strengths of this trial because they have the good quality registries. Next, outcome and power calculation. Originally, the initial primary outcome was defined as the composite of cardiovascular death and hospitalization for heart failure. And the power and sample size was calculated with a event-driven time-to-event approach. Assuming a 0.8 hazard ratio between the intervention and control group, a type 1 error of 4.98%, a total sample size of 6,400 patients would give the study 85% of power. And they expect to see in total 722 events during the trial follow-up time period. But as the trial was ongoing, based on a total blinded count, the observed rate of cardiovascular death or hospitalizations of heart failure was lower than anticipated. So in February 2023, the study modified its primary endpoint to a hierarchical composite outcome that consists many other types of events, not just cardiovascular death and hospitalization for heart failure. It also included non-cardiovascular death or undetermined death, non-fatal MI, atrial fibrillation and flutter event, new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, etc. And they ranked these outcomes, these components by the order of perceived clinical importance. The modified power calculation was based on a win ratio method. And the total sample size was modified to 4,000 from 66,400 with a 5% type 1 error and then 80% of power. The key secondary outcome is similar to the primary outcome, but without the body weight decrease component. The outcome was collected both at the clinical visit through questioning the patient about their overall health and symptoms, and also outside of the clinical visits via information received from standard medical practice. And the statistical analysis part, for the primary and secondary analysis, they used intention to treat population, which is defined as all randomly assigned patients, irrespective of their protocol adherence and continued participation in the trial. And for the safety analysis, they used all randomly assigned patients who received at least one dose of trial treatment. The outcome analysis, they applied the wing ratio method. It's a method often used for composite endpoints to account for the hierarchy of clinical significance of their components and to facilitate inclusion of recurrent events. When I was looking at the wing ratio methods, I feel like I was reading a board game rule. And I'm really not good at explaining board game rule, but I'll try today. So basically, what it does is first, it ranks all the components in the composite outcome by its clinical significance. And then they will match everyone in the treatment group with all the possibility, or every single person in the control group. So patient A in the treatment group will be matched with every single one person A in the treatment group will be matched with every single person in the control group. Person B in the treatment group will also be matched with every single person in the control group. And for each pair, they would compare the outcome of that pair. And whoever that has less clinical significant component will win that pair comparison. And then at the end, they will calculate the ratio of the wins in the treatment groups and the loses in the treatment groups. And if there's a tie between those two groups, then the tie could be ignored. And this is the tie is, ignoring the tie is what the study chose. And this is one of the ways to do the match. There's other ways to do the match. For example, if the treatment and control group was matched on a certain baseline characteristics, then they will be analyzed as a pair at the end. I hope that's clear. And in this study, the expected win ratio between treatment and control group is 1.2, which correspond to 20% higher likelihood of a better cardiometabolic outcomes with the treatment versus placebo. And then we'll dive into results.
Yeah,
Do you want, should we just a second, should we talk about the rationale for that change, or is that upcoming? I don't wanna spoil so what do people think about this change that they made to a key aspect of the study design? Was that well chosen or not, and all that? But again, if that's coming up, we don't need to do this now.
We put the discussion at the end, but
Okay, that's cool.
we can also talk about.
No, that's good. As is my habit, I'm spoiling your presentation. I'm sorry about that. So just we should
no, you're just like hitting the goal without like looking at the result first.
Now people are curious about the end.
Okay.
Yeah, so with such a beautiful study design, let's look at the result. I will just call the dapagliflozin a STAP because it's really a tongue twister for me. So for keeping the sanity, I'll just like abbreviate it to DAP. This table summarizes the baseline characteristics of the participants randomized to DAP or placebo. The two groups were actually well balanced across all the variables. A total of 17 patients were randomized, 2019 to the DAP and 1998 to placebo. And one thing I really want to mention is that, in the group of DAP, you could see that 2019 has been randomized to the intervention group. And finally, only 5 of them are either lost to follow-up or withdrawn their participation to this study. And only 4 lost to follow-up in the placebo group, which means this study has a very excellent follow-up rates and very low dropout rates. The average age was 63 years old, and over 80% of the participants were male. Most patients came from the UK, about 70%, and the remainder enrolled in Sweden. And notably, nearly 90% had reduced left ventricular ejection fraction, with the majority falling between 30 to 49%. This kind of showing like the trial is focusing on patients with impaired systolic function, even though they did not diagnose heart failure at baseline. And in terms of the index event, about 73% presented with STEMI, and most underwent PCI according to the others data in the supplementary files. All participants were clinically stable and received excellent baseline care. For example, over 90% in both groups were on ACE inhibitors or ARBs, beta blockers, statins, and dual antiplatelet therapy. So overall, the 2 groups are well matched and targeted a population with recent MI and subclinical systolic dysfunction, but no prior diabetes or heart failure. This is a pretty well-matched population characteristics here. And next, looking at the hierarchical win ratio, the primary outcome included 7 components ranked by clinical importance, starting from death, then hospitalization for heart failure, non-fatal MI, atrial fibrillation or flutter, new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, the New York Heart Association Plus, and a weight reduction of at least 5%. As you can see in the top bar, the DAP group had significantly more wins than placebo group, with a number of 32.9% versus 24.6%, with a win ratio of 1.34, indicating that 34% greater likelihood of clinical benefit with DAP compared to placebo. And looking at the key secondary outcome, which excludes the weight loss, DAP still showed a significant advantage with a win ratio of 1.2. And the key point to highlight here is that most of the treatment benefit emerged only when the full cardiometabolic profile was considered, especially outcomes like diabetes onset and NYHA class. You will notice that for the top 1 to 3 components like death, heart failure, hospitalization, and myocardial infarction, there was no statistically significant difference, likely due to the low event rate. And overall, this analysis supports the idea that DAP offers broad cardiometabolic benefit beyond just the heart cardiovascular endpoints. This figure, I'm not sure if it's like reading friendly, but it shows the pre-specified subgroup analysis for the primary hierarchical outcome using the win ratio method. Each row represents a different patient subgroup. As you could see, there are examples like age, sex, blood pressure, type of MI, or any prior medical history. The black squares indicate the win ratio, and the horizontal line shows the 95% confidence intervals. What's important here is that the win ratio consistently favored DAP across nearly all the subgroups. The treatment effect was robust and consistent across different clinical profiles. This kind of like strengthens the external validity that supports the potential use of DAP broadly in the post-MI patients without diabetes or chronic heart failures. This table presents the secondary and exploratory outcomes. Starting from the more traditional cardiovascular outcomes, such as cardiovascular death or hospitalization for heart failure, we see that these events were quite low in both groups. For example, the composite of CV death or HF hospitalization occurred in only 2.5% on DAP versus 2.6% on placebo, with a hazard ratio of 0.95, indicating roughly no significant difference. And similar results were observed for MACE, that is major adverse cardiovascular events, including MI, stroke, or CV death, with a hazard ratio of 0.94. And the all-cause or CV-specific mortality were also similar between the two groups. However, one thing to be noticed and a significant difference is the risk of developing new onset type 2 diabetes. This occurred in 2% of DAP-treated patients versus about 4% in placebo, indicating around a 47% relatively risk reduction. In terms of the weight, there was a benefit. The placebo-corrected mean change in the body weight was kind of like reduced 1.65 kilograms in the DAP group. Other events, including the new onset atrial fibrillation, stroke, MI, and all-cause hospitalization, showed no statistically significant differences, though numerically favored DAP in some cases. Overall, the biggest takeaway here is that while major cardiovascular event rates were too low to detect the differences, the study still showed that DAP has clear metabolic benefits. This table shows the safety results, including any serious adverse events during the trials. Overall, the rate of serious adverse events leading to a death was identical between the groups, 1.5% in both DAP and placebo. Serious adverse events leading to hospitalization were slightly more frequent in the DAP group, with a number of 18% versus 17%, which is a small difference. And looking at any SAE, the incidence was 20.4% in the DAP group and 19% in placebo. Importantly, there is no increase in the known SGLT2 related adverse effects. Kidney function was also stable across the groups. These patterns show the safety profile of the DAP was very similar to the placebo, with no excess risk of any specific serious cardiac or non-cardiac complications. The key point here is that no new safety signals were identified, and that's important because this trial included patients shortly after an acute MI, a setting where safety is very critical. Looking at the findings, first, with all the above results, the researchers concluded that DAP resulted in a significant benefit in terms of cardiometabolic outcomes compared to placebo, with up to 34% more wins in the primary outcomes. The full win ratio benefit was consistent across all the subgroups. And besides, they find that DAP resulted in a lower incidence of new diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and a reduced mean body weight. It has strengths and limitations. As for those strengths, they have been discussed before, but we will address some limitations here. Registry-based RCT, it did bring some real-world data, but one limitation here is that it's only being conducted in Sweden and UK in the study, and predominantly their European population, and we don't know whether the same conclusion will be applied to any other populations. And the second concern is that the primary endpoint was revised due to the low event accrual at the very beginning. And we will have some follow-up questions on this point. And the next thing is that they chose a lot of endpoints that's not definitive outcomes, such as death or hospitalization. Instead, they chose some clinical outcomes such as weight or the New York Heart Association class. They may favor the treatment naturally that kind of like potentially bias the final outcomes. And last, the researchers also admit that it's not powered to detect small differences in hard CV events such as CV mortality or hospitalization with this study design. Overall, the study concludes that this trial demonstrated a significant benefit of DAB in terms of cardiometabolic outcomes compared with placebo, especially in the population without diabetes or chronic heart failures presenting with acute myocardial infarction and impaired LV systolic function during the index MI hospitalization, and there's no new safety concerns being observed. With all these results and conclusions in mind, let's jump to the final discussions. We have some questions. We probably don't have answers by ourselves, but we think it's pretty interesting to raise this question on the board. We ask for the contributions from both students and faculties because these are really interesting ones. The first is that from the methodology of this clinical trial, it seems like they're combining some objective and subjective outcomes. For example, they're mixing the mortality and the NYHA classes into a single ranked endpoint. And we are wondering, would this have skewed perception of the drug's impact?
So can you go back to the slide? I think it's 37 with all the individual outcomes.
You mean this one or?
No,
this
that
one?
one.
Yep.
Okay. So if you look closely at this, it looks like there's really no difference in cardiac events. The only big difference is diabetes and the weight. And I'm less concerned with objective and subjective than I am with the fact that the cardiac and stroke events are all clear-cut events related to cardiovascular function. The diabetes is metabolic, and yes, it may have an influence later on, but it appears to be the only thing that's driving the difference between the two groups. And I would have favored a priori, and I don't mind the heart class one because that's still a cardiac outcome. If you wanted to do this, looking at all the cardiac outcomes and combining, but not combining the diabetes, they've reached a conclusion that it's favorable for cardiometabolic events when it's only favorable on metabolic events. And I'm not very pleased. I would take a very different interpretation of these data looking at them. The other thing is, this is almost predictable that it would have an effect, might have an effect on diabetes and weight loss. The real question is, would it help cardiac events? And I would answer, it doesn't. And then lastly, the number needed to treat to reduce the diabetes incidence, is huge. It's 50. So my conclusion is I would never use this for this indication based upon looking closely at the data as opposed to what they write in the paper. And, Stefan, I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this subject.
Yeah, and I have some similar thoughts. And I think in addition, Doug, to your interpretation of the data, and I agree with that, they changed their hypothesis, right? Because the metabolics was not part of the initial hypothesis, I don't think. Initially, they were just looking at different ones, at the classic outcomes. And then now, and when they were faced with that problem, that they didn't have enough events. And I mean, I get that. So that's an unpleasant thing to happen in a trial. And then they really try to ramp up that number and put the metabolics in. So they kind of changed their hypothesis there a little bit, but that changing of the hypothesis does then not really feature in their final recommendation.
Yeah, and I also don't like changing the primary outcome. I mean, I think there was a time when the FDA would have, I think, said you should have stopped the trial for futility and done another trial. I don't think they're that rigid anymore, but I'm not very pleased with what they did. I don't know how other people feel. It's like, well, we're failing. The trial is not going to reach any conclusion, so let's change the outcome so we can reach a conclusion and publish a paper with a positive result. I'm not sure I like that.
Yeah, other thoughts on that? Because it's interesting. I think I was really pleased with you guys choosing this paper because I think it's a really interesting one.
Yeah, because we second that when I am discussing this paper with Jess together, we still raise the question like, what's the point for raising that? For stating that there's a big benefit here for reducing the body weight because
Yes.
literally it has no meaning here.
1.5 kilograms.
1.5 kilograms. Yeah, that's really a minor change. And with that in mind, I think I'll just like jump to the third question. Is there any other concerns regarding the change of the primary outcome while the trial is still ongoing?
Sort of touched base on this.
Yeah, touched a little bit on that, right? So, and again, I think I'm sympathetic to the investigators in some way because this is going on, right? So, and then they see they don't have enough events. They probably did a conditional power analysis. They saw they didn't have enough events. Oh my God, what are we gonna do here? So I get that they wanted to do something and change something, and they needed to make it big, so they didn't want to change a little bit, so they need to do a conditional power again and then see, it's still not enough. No, we need to change the. So that I think that was the bind they were in, and then they pulled in those metabolic parts. But they and I again I'm sympathetic, I guess, but they should have, I think, interpreted this a little bit more cautiously. So at least that, in my opinion. But I mean, you can see this differently, I guess.
So then the follow-up question to that is, if it was you, would you do anything different? Like, what's the alternative approach to by changing the primary outcomes? Something that I sorry,
go ahead. Sorry.
Something I thought of is like they can just take longer, extend the follow-up time to wait until the events occur, but then the sponsor is a pharmaceutical company, which of course extending follow-up time would cost them more money. So it makes sense that they didn't choose this, but what would you do differently?
I think you could increase the sample size, or you could increase the duration of follow-up. And I recognize that those have financial implications. Or you could accept the fact that the study is going to not show a significant difference and be done with it. I don't think that changing the primary outcome was an appropriate response. And I think the other thing, which is that, the hope was that this would make a difference in this is my inference and guess, that this treatment would make a difference in cardiovascular events, and that therefore there would be an indication for its use in that situation. And it didn't at all, in my opinion. So I think not only was changing problematic, but the way they changed it was also problematic. That's my take on it. And so I think they should have either accepted the fact that they were not going to show a difference, or increased either sample size or duration of follow-up in order to get more events.
Yeah. Or like it could have also been a mixture. Now, Doug, as you were speaking, I was thinking of that. So you could also like stick to the hard endpoints, like add in other criteria like the New York Heart Association class. I think that was added in later also. So class, and then so stick to the type of events so that you don't need to change your hypothesis, right?
Right.
And then try and prolong your follow-up period. Try to prolong, or try to increase the sample size, something along those lines. So without changing your hypothesis. And I can't know that, but I would guess they probably discussed it, but then maybe they then thought, but that's too risky. What if we again don't get enough events?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that doing this as a registry trial was clever and seemed to work.
Agree.
Nobody showed me anything in the presentation of the data that suggests that it didn't work. Having said that, you can only do a registry trial like this in countries where everybody's registered. So your limitations are Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and the UK, I think.
Right.
So you certainly could not do this in the United States, where nobody's registered for anything in terms of their healthcare. It's not quite true, but we don't have national registries like this. So, but I think the methodology worked okay, and it's unfortunate that what they did in terms of the outcome and that their overinterpretation of the data based upon only two subclasses of the primary outcome obscure the fact that this was an interesting methodologic paper, and the methodology seemed to work. Does anybody have any familiarity with their statistical approach and sort of its acceptance going forward, or because that's one which I have not heard of before?
This is also the first time I heard this approach, and I looked it up. Seems like it's commonly used in cardiovascular health research, where there's a composite outcomes, and then there is a long article discussing the pitfalls of this methods. For example, the win ratio doesn't really consider the ties, so you're basically excluding part of the participants. I only use part of the data that collected, and also about the interpretation and the inference of whether or not having a high win ratio would translate to clinical benefit. That's another.
Right. I think that's right. And on top of that, or maybe better, that comes on top of all the concerns you might have for these composite endpoints, right? That are to be fair, very, very common in cardiovascular health research. But it is still a mix of different events, and all of that, of course, is done to create more of them to increase the power. So there are people who have, I don't have like a fundamental issue with composite endpoints, but there are purists who question the use of a composite in the first place.
They probably could. I didn't really do much research on this, but they could still do time to event outcome and use that approach to analyze the data, right? Without using win ratio.
They could, but
Right.
they have some recurring events, and some of those recurring events are actually the less severe ones, so take that into consideration as well.
That's true.
Because and I mean, let's go into the interpretation. It's really these endpoints now, and especially this one, is really hard to interpret, because either you have a delayed onset of diabetes, or you have less heart attacks, or you are hospitalized less, or you die more frequently or you lose weight. Like that is the interpretation is really because the operator is or, it's not and, right? So
Right.
the interpretation I think is really like those are very different. When either you have a heart attack or you lose weight.
Right.
That's a little bit of a tough interpretation there.
Right.
And I'm reminded of my own teaching materials in the 750 series when I did a little thing on composite outcomes. And one of the quality, quote unquote, quality criteria for a composite is that all these events should have roughly a similar importance to the participants and or the clinicians, right? And losing weight and having a heart attack, that seems like very, very different events to me, and a very different importance of events.
Does anyone know whether the win ratio approach was always their primary analysis method, or did they add that when they also changed the primary outcome?
No, they changed the methods when they changed the primary outcome, because
Okay.
the original approach is the event-driven time to event
Oh,
approach.
right. That's right. You did say that. Yeah.
Right. So they changed it when they modified the primary outcome.
So I'm even less supportive.
I think they were trying to show a little bit that the change maybe have less impact is by saying that they did a blinded count of events without doing any interim analysis. I don't know how much that helps, but if they did an interim analysis and changed the primary endpoints, then that would probably just sort of destroy the trial.
Yeah, that's right. I think I talked about a conditional power, but I think you're right. It was a blinded event count that they did, right? Mhm.
Right. Yeah, that's
I
most
think,
of the
most of the
questions
discussion questions, and
we
it's,
have.
naturally answered our remaining two questions.
Yeah.
I have a question, so kind of tied to what Doug was asking earlier. So if you were the PI on this project and you see the early data, and you also like kind of learn the population as you go, because this is probably the lower risk population, so the event rate is lower than expected from what you observe from the other DAPA trials. But what would you do design-wise differently? Like, would you kind of consider using a subset of the population, say a higher risk population, and then interpret the trial differently, or just like terminate the trial and then design a new one? I'm trying to think that what could you do differently?
So subgroup analyses are notoriously unreliable and unrepeatable. And so even if they're planned, you get some benefit if you plan to look within randomization strata, but it doesn't look like this was a stratified randomization. So I don't think, I would not favor that. The history of trials is littered with industry making that mistake. It didn't work in this, but it worked in that subgroup. Let's do a trial in that subgroup, and then it fails again because it just doesn't work.
Well,
I think,
why May is probably like, so you realize that the event rate is low, so then you change the study design to focus on a higher risk group of population, and kind of change your eligibility criteria, and then
well, if you do that, you have a problem in that some of your original recruitment patients no longer fit the eligibility criteria
right.
for the trial. And if you then just don't include those patients in your final analysis, you have lost randomization within that subset, where you have excluded patients because you didn't stratify by high risk versus low risk. And again, I will defer to people who do a lot of analysis of these trials, but that seems to me to be a pretty dicey decision. I think you're not, I think your choices, if you see that your event rate is low, are what we described before, which is to up the sample size, up the duration, or take your lumps. And particularly if you do a futility analysis and realize you'll never finish the trial, stop and do a new one with better eligibility criteria. Having said that, this group, in fact, they all had a heart attack. They were a high risk group, right? This is not a general population. This is people with an index heart attack. So they went for a high risk group. It's just that, unfortunately for them, the physicians caring for the patients were doing such a good job that they didn't get a lot of enough events. So I don't know. I mean, Stefan, Dave, any thoughts along that line?
Oh, I think that's right. I think
Yeah,
that's right.
I agree. I think, I'm not very comfortable with what changes they made and the manner in which they implemented them. It seems like it's a weight loss trial dressed up as a cardiac protection trial.
Yeah.
Sure, weight loss might help that. There are other ways to lose weight too.
Yeah. And it's just 1.5 kilos. So it's not the massive weight
Yeah,
loss.
yeah.
Yeah. That's right.
I was also thinking, because this trial is using real-world registry, would it be possible if they prolong the follow-up using just purely the registry data to collect outcome information without doing the other information collection that specifically require participants to come in for clinical visits, kind of switching from a positive data collection approach to not negative, no. What is that called?
Active to passive.
Passive, yes, active and passive, not positive and negative. Passive data collection approach and see if there's more outcome.
Yeah, I had that thought too, Jesse, and it might be ongoing. Maybe they're doing that right now. Maybe they do.
Maybe.
They're running a passive follow-up and might update their results.
So
On their data, sorry. So remember their original target of doing the sample size calculation is like 700 people having the primary event. But then at the end of the study, if you just look at their original plan primary endpoint, they only have 100. So it's probably way too low to choose like lengthening the trial duration.
Yeah.
And this is, and I just want to add that this is a little puzzling because they should have had the data at their fingertips in that registry setting, right? So it's not like when we recruit a fresh population and we don't really know what's happening. It is interesting that they underestimated, or they overestimated the number of events in a population that they knew. So that is a little bit interesting.
That is a good point.
Yeah, that's true. I think they did estimate the numbers based on the previous registry data.
So
But Lijuan is right. They were way off. Sorry, Doug. Go ahead, please.
yeah, so the question, of course, is who signed up for this study, right? If the overall population event rate was 5 times of second cardiac events or second MACE events in those who'd had second cardiac events in those who'd already had a cardiac event was 5 times this, then what patients were signing up for the study? Why was the event rate so low? Because presumably they didn't randomize the entire country. They randomized the subset that signed up for the study. So,
And this is also a group of patients also receiving standard of care
Right,
when hospitalized. So
yeah. Well, speaking of that, another good, good thing about this trial, good, interesting point that we find is that the follow-up, the loss to follow-up rate is very low. It's only like 5 patients lost
Yeah,
to follow
5
up.
patients lost to
crazy.
follow up with
That's
really
crazy.
great quality. So we were like, you know, really signing that with such a low dropout
Mhm.
rates, but like
Yeah.
produce such a relatively less attention results. We really think that it's a pity, like it seems like not using this data set, but still I think it circles back to the problem is for its eligibility criteria. As you look back, it has a very loose criteria on the inclusion criteria, which means they include a pretty large range of targeted population. So I think that's really something
Yeah,
that
incredible.
contribute to the low rates of events.
Yeah. Well, then the high quality of the registry probably contribute to the low follow-up, the loss to follow-up. I did read about their registries a little bit. It's quite interesting. They did some high, like the data auditing and stuff and cover the whole nations. It's interesting approach, which probably can't be translated here, but you know, hopefully one day.
they both have national health services, right? So, you know, this
Yeah,
is
I think
a
that's
centrally
right.
administered health system with a national registry that enables them to do this. You can't do this in a decentralized system like you have in the United States.
Right, you could maybe do this in some of the health systems like Geisinger, etc. So maybe there, but
Yeah.
that's right. Mhm.
Working with a company called Trinex,
And-
and they actually are pulling data together from multiple systems in the US. I forgot how many. It's actually an international registry, but a large portion of it is US based. So
Yeah, although one of the problems with using something like Geisinger is that in an employer-based financing for healthcare, there is healthcare provider turnover each year, depending upon the contracts that are negotiated between the big industries and the healthcare provider. And I don't know what it is today in the United States, but several years ago, it was about 20%. In other words, every year, 20% of the people would get a new healthcare provider, insurer, or system based upon what their employer had done. So you'd think you could do it in Geisinger, but you're still going to have loss to follow-up as people change, you know, Kaiser and Geisinger, as employers change healthcare provider systems.
That's. Any final thoughts or questions?
I thought that was a really interesting one. Good choice, guys.
excellent.
Agree.
Okay, thanks everyone. We'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.